In our last video, we got a look at the wild animals and the weapons in UNGA BUNGA, and we saw how they would interact with each other. Now let's see how this would play out using the actual cards in a normal game. Here we have a typical match laid out. We will be playing from the bottom and we'll be able to see our cards. We've made a couple of our own items, and the player on our right has also made a few items. The player on our left has not made any items at all, and the player across from us has made all the items except for clothes. Now, reading from the rules. If you send a wild animal after another player, you will hand the other player either a bitey cat, a growly beast, or a stompy monster card. In this situation, we have a growly beast, so let's give it to the player on our right. If your opponent cannot beat the wild animal, you can look at their cards and take a card of your choice, and they will have to draw a new card to maintain 5 cards in their hand. In this situation, the player on our right was not able to beat the growly beast, so they will have to show us their cards. We're going to take the card that we want, and they will have to take a 5th card from the deck. Once this play has been completed, the growly beast will go into the discard pile. This is now the end of our turn, and we're not allowed to use the card that we stole to make an item. The player on our left will go next, and they have chosen to throw a bitey cat at the player on our right. This time, the player on our right is able to defeat the bitey cat. From the rules, if your opponent beats the wild animal, they can use those cards to make clothes, provided that they have already made their first tool, and clothes are not their final item to make. So in this situation, the player on our right has already made their tool, and clothes are not their final thing to make. So they will use the bitey cat and the clubby stick to make their clothes. This is now the end of the player on our left's turn. As per the rules, if the wild animal is beaten, both players will draw a new card. The player across from us will now take their turn, and they're going to throw a stompy monster at the player on our left. The player on our left is going to use an UNGA BUNGA wild card to defeat the stompy monster. Because the player on our left has not made their tool yet, they will not be able to use these cards to make clothes, and these 2 cards will go back in the discard pile. Both players will take a card to replace the one that they used, and the player to the right of us will now take their turn. The player to the right of us is first going to make fire. Then they are going to throw a stompy monster at us. When making items and throwing monsters at another player, you must remember to make the item first before you throw the monster, like the player to the right of us did. We now have to defeat the stompy monster that the player to the right of us had given us. We do not have a pointy stick or a wild card, so we cannot defeat the stompy monster. The player to the right of us now gets to look at our cards and take whichever card they want, and we will have to draw a new card to replace the one that they stole. The stompy monster will be placed in the discard pile, and the player to the right of us will take the 2 cards that they need to replace the ones they used to make fire. It's now our turn again. And from the rules, players may also make clothes by pairing the appropriate wild animal with a suitable weapon from the cards in their hand. With the cards in our hand, we have a bitey cat and a clubby stick. So with those 2 cards, we can make clothes. We cannot make any other play with the remaining 3 cards in our hands, so we'll just draw 2 more cards to replace the ones we used. Drawing cards from either the deck or another player signifies the end of your turn, so the player to the left of us will now make their move. The player to the left of us is going to use a stompy monster and give it to the player across from us. And the player across from us is going to use a pointy stick to defeat the stompy monster. Although the player across from us was able to defeat the Stompy monster, they are not allowed to use those cards to make clothes because they must use their own 2 cards to make clothes if clothes are their last item to make. So these 2 cards will go into the discard pile and both players will draw a new card. That concludes the section on wild animals. We will now move into making items.